I think that music is a genuine mystery. Music is one of the experiential phenomena that we all have access to. It's like looking into the night sky or at the Grand Canyon. There's something about it that seems to speak about things that are beyond the mundane. And it's an interesting thing that music can do that, because although it has this arguably transcendental element, it's also something that's very accessible to people in general. It's very rare to find someone who doesn't like music. So it's transcendental and universal at the same time. It also seems to me that music reliably speaks to people of meaning, and that the reason that music plays such a popular or powerful role in our culture is because the meaning that music speaks of is beyond rational critique. And we're very rational and we're very intelligent, and so we've been able to make intellectual hash out of most of the things that had traditionally offered people a grounded sense of meaning. But because music is beyond rational criticism, it seems to have been able to retain its experiential connection with transcendent meaning, despite the fact that our rational mind has destroyed almost everything else that's transcendental. And part of the reason I think music can do this is precisely because it is beyond either verbal formulation or verbal criticism. So if you listen to a song, whether it has lyrics or not, you could perhaps assume that it doesn't, it does something to you. And if someone who had never heard music asked you what it did, you couldn't tell them in any way that was a reasonable summary of the experience itself. I suppose you could consider that analogous to trying to describe color to someone who's blind. Whatever music is about isn't translatable into language. Now, we can use language to augment our pleasure in music. We do that with lyrics constantly. But whatever it is that music speaks of, if it speaks of something, is not something you can speak of in words. Now, as rational people, we're also inclined to presume that if it's real, you can speak about it in words. But there have been cultures since the dawn of history believed that there were certain things that were not only unspeakable from a verbal perspective, but whose meaning was actually demolished if it was put in words. I mean, for example, in ancient Hebrew societies and in current Islam societies, it's heretical, improper to make an image of the transcendent. And the reason for that, it's not merely an arbitrary moral law, nonsensical from a rational perspective. The reason for that is that some things lose their meaning as soon as they're translated into something that's as tiny as a word. And music is one of those things. Now, I made this little painting here. It's about 7 feet across, actually, when I was a graduate student about 20 years ago, trying to figure out what meaning meant. And I designed the painting, I'll show you a bigger picture of it later, to be something that would kind of move when you looked at it. If you make a geometrical figure that's sufficiently complex, then when your brain looks at it, it tries on different fits, and it looks to your visual perception system as if it's moving. A Necker cube, a reversing cube, is a simple example of that. I wanted to make something here that moved and danced visually like a piece of music moves and dances, that seems to intimate something beyond itself. It's hard to do that with a static sculpture. It's hard to do that with visual arts in general. We do seem to approach it to some degree with dance. And dance is another art form that speaks of things that are beyond words. That doesn't mean that dance is about nothing. It just means that it's about something that can't be easily put into words. Now, I actually think you can understand what music means, but there's a real problem in doing it. And the problem in understanding what music means is that it's only simple if you change the way you look at almost everything. The funny thing is that music speaks to you of meaning whether you understand it or not. And that's one of the reasons it's an imperishable art. Now, I think what music speaks to you of is real. In fact, I think it's more real than anything else. But I would also say that's not normally how people think. Okay, so that's the first part of the spiel. So I want to tell you some interesting things about perception. Now, there's this problem that's come up in the last quarter of the 20th century that was formally described by Daniel Dennett, among others. It's been something that's been plaguing people who've been attempting to design machines that can actually operate in the real world. Early artificial intelligence researchers were pretty optimistic about building things like general-purpose robots because they believed that a robot could, while they believed fundamentally that the world laid itself out in easily accessible objects and that those objects had some reality beyond their perceptual appearance, and that the problem with developing a machine that could operate in the real world was only determining how it should act. But it turns out that wasn't right. It turns out that it's very, very hard to make a machine that can perceive. In fact, it's so hard that it seems technically impossible. And that's strange because we can perceive. But the problem we solve while we perceive is so complex that in some ways it appears uncomputable, which is why, by the way, one of the reasons we don't have general-purpose robots. It's also why we don't have computers that can accurately translate speech. You know, you're supposed to be able to talk to your computer. People have been promising that for 30 years. But you can't talk to your computer because a computer can't understand what you're saying. And the reason for that is it turns out it's very difficult to listen to what someone's saying, and that's partly because all of the information is not encoded in the sounds that they're making. So, for example, part of the reason you can understand what I'm saying is that you know more or less that this is a lecture about psychology. You know it has a scientific basis. You know that there are certain things I'm not going to talk about. The entire context within which you sit informs your understanding of my speech. And every word I say helps build a framework for you that informs your ability to understand each word. Computer just can't do that. Well, Dennett called this the frame problem. And the frame problem was put in a very simple way by Medina Neguilar in the MIT Encyclopedia of Cognitive Science. Medina Neguilar pointed out that you can categorize a relatively small, finite number of objects in virtually an infinite number of ways. And you might think, well, what does that have to do with looking at the world? And the answer to that is, well, perception is a form of categorization. When you look at something, you know what that thing is. Your visual system is doing a kind of classification. But it turns out that there's a very large number of ways to look at things. So, for example, right now I'm looking at you as if you're an audience full of people. But if I was an Impressionist painter, I could be looking at you as if you were surfaces from which certain colored lights were reflecting. And you might think that that, I suppose, in some way is obvious, but it's useful to remember that when the Impressionists had their first shows in Paris, basing their artistic production on this transformation of perception, they caused riots. All right, so perception is a very difficult process, and artists actually teach us how to see. And I don't mean that, I don't mean that in some impractical way. I mean that the way we use our eyes has been informed for hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps, by the experts among us who were able to use their visual systems better than anyone else and who could communicate that. It's hard to see the world. Well, you can think of that if you're playing chess. You know, we had to build big computers to beat grandmasters at chess, and they can barely do it, and that's all they can do, right? Big Blue plays chess, but it can't walk down the street, and it's not good at riding a bicycle. It's a one-purpose machine, and the way it plays chess isn't the way that people play chess. It plays chess by doing a reasonably exhaustive search of every single combination. And on a chessboard, there's an unbelievably large number of potential combinations of moves. It's immense. And a chess game is a rather bounded world. You know, all things considered, there's a finite number of men. They have finite rules, but nonetheless, it's an unbelievably complex environment in terms of its space of possibilities. Expert chess players appear to identify configurations of men that have some relevance. So what they're able to do is to look at the board and rapidly determine what they should pay attention to and what they shouldn't pay attention to, and they develop that skill by practicing over thousands of games and studying chess games and so forth and so on. We don't duplicate that with a computer. And so what you could say is that an expert chess player is an expert at being able to see a chessboard. And they see extremely well, and then once they've seen, they can kind of put constraints around the cognitive complexity of the problem and operate within that. Well, you guys are doing that all the time when you look at the world, but there's so much of your brain devoted to it, and you're so bloody good at it that you don't even know what's happening. And when you look at the world, it's like, there it is, and that's all objective and obvious, and there's the objects, and you know, they have nothing to do with your perception. But it is absolutely not that clear. And it's not clear for a lot of reasons. I mean, one is the frame problem. The other is that it turns out that when you look at the world, you don't see objects and then think about them and then figure out how to act. Your eyes map onto all sorts of parts of your body. So, for example, your retinas map right onto your spinal cord. And that means your eyes can make your body move without you thinking and without you seeing. That's a pretty weird thing. It's hard to understand until you understand that what your retina is doing is picking up patterns. Because it's like a matrix, right? It's like a TV screen. It picks up patterns from the outside world, and then it translates them into patterns of motor output. There's no intermediation of perception whatsoever if you're moving very quickly. And there can't be, because it takes you too long to see anything to be fast. That's why, by the way, when you drive down the road in your car, you don't look right in front of the hood. So what good is that? If you see it in front of the hood, you've already run over it. You have to look like half a second down the road, because anything that happens to you closer than that, it's already too late. So you look far enough down the road so that you can get your body to do what you want it to do and take into account how long it takes you to see the world, which may be up to half a second. I mean, that's one estimate. I think that's too long, but that's the standard estimate at the time. Half a second's a long time. You go 40 feet in a car going 60 miles an hour in half a second. The point I'm making there is that when you see the object, the seeing produces the action. So, for example, you have a little mechanism in your motor system that allows you to grab things. And you practiced the hell out of that when you were 2 years old, right? You were just grabbing things left, right, and center until you got the grip motion down to an automated state. Well, if you look at a cup, the act of looking at the cup reduces the threshold for activation of the grip mechanism. And that isn't because you see the cup and then you think, I'll pick it up. It happens as a consequence of seeing it. And it turns out that when you're looking at the world, you don't see objects exactly. What you see is things that it's useful to interact with. And those things are more like tools. And so I would say, well, you're looking in this room, and what you see are things to interact with. And you think those are objective objects, but they're really not. Or maybe they are, but they're a very, very, very tiny subset of all the objects you could see in this room. Someone like a schizophrenic whose perceptions have been somewhat fragmented, they have a hard time focusing on the universal class of usable objects that everybody looks at. And so a schizophrenic, and sometimes an artist too, can get lost in contemplation of the complex patterns in the carpet, or the shades of colors that are in the person's shirt next to you, or all these complex things that you can see around you but that you pay no attention to whatsoever. How do you ignore all that? You ignore almost everything. 99.9 and far more % of everything that's around you, you don't see. You see relevant things, and we really don't know how you do it. Now, you know already how complex a chess game is, and how uncomputable that is. Yet you're interacting with an environment whose complexity leaves a chess game in the dust. Your environment is composed of an infinite number of hierarchically stacked chess games, and yet you wander through it without a second's thought unless something goes wrong. Turns out that perception is the hard part. Now, artists have always known this, and you get modern artists like, I believe that's Magritte on the right. Magritte is telling you that the average person is blinded by their presuppositions, right? That's what that painting means. And the visual illusion on the left, which was constructed by a perceptual scientist, shows how with knowledge of the visual system you can play games with it. And the game there is, well, what is that exactly? Is it an amalgam of lines, or is it a square in the middle of a diamond? Well, I would say it's both of those, and then what it is to you depends on what it is that you would do with it. Well, you don't do anything with that except look at it, but your visual system doesn't know that. It's Duchamp on the left, nude descending a staircase. Well, Why is that a nude descending a staircase? Well, you may be able to see it and you may not be able to see it, but what it is that it's the geometric figure of a human being with the fourth dimension averaged across the fourth dimension. The fourth dimension is time. What you see is the nude transformed into a geometric figure at each point of the descent down the staircase. Now you might say, well, that's not a realist painting. And I would say, well, don't be so sure about that. Abstraction sometimes is more real than reality. Or do you think that numbers are less real than things? Well, I tell you, you can do a lot of things with numbers you can't do with things. And you could argue that the numbers are more real than the things. And I could say, well, that's more real than what you see. Because you can't see time across sequences. You only see it in slices, and that's across sequences. And then there's Picasso on the left. And part of what Picasso was doing, apart from playing with time and angle, was trying to determine just how badly you could mangle and decompose an iconic image and still be able to recognize it as an image. And it turns out, well, there's not a single thing in that painting that's reminiscent of a face. It's the gestalt that does it. And you have a specialized system in your brain. It's attached to your emotional systems in an area called the amygdala that partly deals with fear. That is a specialized face detector system. And it's so specialized that if you turn faces upside down, it loses about 60 or 70% of its ability to discriminate. It's really specialized. You look at people and their faces pop out and you think, man, there's so much difference between faces. There's not that much difference at all, objectively speaking, and it's certainly possible for you to have a stroke that will leave you almost entirely intellectually and perceptually intact, and yet be absolutely unable to tell one face from another. Well, on the bottom left, I guess that's a little girl. Well, how is it that you can know that? Well, it's partly because Picasso has taught you to see things like that, but also because your visual system is unbelievably good at producing rapid abstractions. Think about it this way. You know those simple drawings that kids make of stick figures? Those aren't simple, right? Because a stick figure doesn't look anything like a person. In fact, it looks about as unlike a person as anything possibly could and still be a person. The thing that's so interesting about a kid's stick figure is it gives you insight into the tremendous ability of them to abstract away from reality, right? And they're really not images at all. They're like hieroglyphs. They're quasi-linguistic representations because, you know, a stick figure is the next best thing to a written symbol. Kids, they just generate those nonstop. House, this is a house. It's got some smoke coming out of it, right? You recognize that house in no time flat. Kid 3 years old, 4 years old can spin one of those off in no time flat. Their perceptual systems are unbelievably sophisticated, and they do not merely map self-evident objects onto the cognitive system. Perception doesn't work like that at all, and it's difficult to overemphasize that. A nude, two people on a beach, grief. Now that's a really interesting one. You can just nail that as grief in no time flat. Why? Well, the color, it's death, green and purple. I don't know what he did with the eyes, why it manages it so well. And this appears like a tear, I think. And this, of course, is a handkerchief. It's a striking image, and it's so mangled that it's almost beyond recognition. Nonetheless, you can categorize it from an emotional perspective in no time flat. What's that? It's a Dalmatian. There's the head. Do you see it? There's the leg. There's the leg. There's the back of it. Does everybody see the Dalmatian? How many people see it? It's there, right? How many people don't see it? Well, is it there or not? Collar, head, shadow, leaves, background, sidewalk. Once you get it, you can't not see it. If you don't get it, if you don't grip it as a gestalt, what is it? Random patterns. Well, they're not random, but that's only because you're familiar with dogs and living things. That's as much of a random pattern as anything you could generate, except that it also happens to be a dog.